Peace is not surrender. The president of Ukraine held a meeting with the American delegation while Europe opposed the new US plan for a settlement in Ukraine. Ukrainian sanctions are in effect. The defense forces struck the Ryazan oil refinery, and in the Perm region, an entire train carrying petroleum products and gas condensate was destroyed. Siversk remains under the control of Ukrainian defense forces. There are no Russian occupiers in the city. Everything that's happening on the front line and Russian-style cronyism in all its glory. Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov arranged a job for his mistress at the Russian Ministry of Defense. And now let's go over everything in detail. Don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the Ukraine Today YouTube channel. Volodymyr Zelenskyy has received a draft of the American peace plan and will discuss it with Trump. According to the American side, the plan could energize diplomacy. This was reported by the Office of the President of Ukraine. This was reported by the Office of the President of Ukraine. The day before, Zelenskyy held a meeting with the American delegation. He met with U.S. Secretary of the Army Dan Driscoll and U.S. generals. After that, a meeting in an expanded format took place. Among others, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, participated in it. Let me remind you that on Wednesday, several publications citing their own sources reported that US and Russian officials had developed a plan to end the war in Ukraine. According to unofficial information, the plan was developed with the participation, in particular, of the Russian dictator's envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, and the US President's special representative, Steve Witkoff. On November 19th in Turkey, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy was also planning to discuss the Ukrainian version of the peace plan with Witkoff, but according to Axios, the talks did not take place because the head of the Ukrainian state arrived in Turkey with a document that had been developed jointly with European allies. Sanctions from the US, the resilience of the Ukrainian armed forces, the collapse of the oil refining industry. All of this is making Russia much more willing to negotiate than before. So, will Putin agree to terms acceptable to Ukraine? Our journalists have already looked into this.
Peace is closer than ever. The White House expects that a framework agreement to end the war between Russia and Ukraine will be reached by all parties by the end of the month, and under the most favorable conditions, even as soon as this week, reports Politico. However, it is quite possible that such a peace will not satisfy either Ukraine or Europe, and Russia will simply use it as time to prepare for the next attack. The publication Access, citing anonymous sources, claims that while a corruption scandal, the so-called Mindichgate, was raging in Ukraine and a political crisis was unfolding, the US and Russia prepared their own peace plan. And they did so in secret not only from Zelenskyy's administration but also from their Western partners. According to
Axios sources, the 28 points of the plan can be divided into 4 categories: peace in Ukraine, security guarantees, security in Europe, and the future relationship of the US with Russia and Ukraine. It is still unknown how the plan addresses contentious issues such as control over territories in eastern Ukraine, where Russian troops are gradually advancing but still control much less land than the Kremlin demands. According to
Axios, behind these nearly 30 points are meetings between Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Kremlin Envoy Kirill Dmitriev. Allegedly, the two of them held intensive negotiations in Miami at the end of October. Dmitriev himself confirmed the information to the journalist and stated that in Moscow, they feel that the Russian position has truly been heard.
Dmitriev told Axios that the main idea is to take the principles that Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed upon at the meeting in Alaska in August and develop a proposal that would resolve the conflict in Ukraine, as well as restore US-Russia relations and address Russia's security concerns. This is actually a much broader framework, which essentially raises the question of how to finally ensure lasting security in Europe, not just in Ukraine, he said.
What exactly the Russians and Americans agreed upon remains a mystery, but both before and after the Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska, the Kremlin made no secret of its ambitions. There aren't even any differences from the original plan. In Moscow, they still want, and this has been stated by Lavrov, to control the government, the church, the media, and the status of the Russian language as a state language, as well as to achieve demilitarization and a non-aligned status.
There are 28 points grouped into 4 categories which are hidden behind rather favorable-sounding names such as security guarantees and European stability. But what could Dmitriev and Witkoff possibly come up with? I think that's a rhetorical question. Apparently, the US really does believe that they are close to some kind of agreement. But for us, it's important to understand that, as always, these agreements are being discussed without Ukraine. And as always, they're trying to present Ukraine with a fait accompli.
Politico and Reuters report that an American delegation has secretly arrived in Ukraine. Trump sent Dan Driscoll, the Secretary of the Army, to Kyiv, a friend of Vice President Jay Devins from Yale Law School, who has become a key figure in the Pentagon. Allegedly, he will not only be interested in Ukrainian developments in the field of drones, but will also promote Trump's desire to announce the end of his ninth war as soon as possible. A meeting between Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the Americans is expected to take place after his return to Ukraine. On Wednesday, the president visited Ankara, where he planned to meet with Witkoff, but Witkoff cancelled his trip to Turkey. The plan of Witkoff and Dmitriev, which they are trying to persuade the Ukrainians to accept, is being actively discussed against the backdrop of a political crisis in Kyiv itself, with demands for ministers' resignations and the formation of a new government. Amid the potential redistribution of influence and portfolios, Russia once again barbarically attacked Ukrainian cities. In Ternopil alone, the number of casualties has approached 30, to nearly 30, and the number of injured to almost 100.
Peace cannot mean capitulation. European states have declared that they do not support the US peace plan to end the war in Ukraine, which the Allies regard as de facto capitulation. Reuters reports this. According to two sources familiar with the matter, Washington has told President Volodymyr Zelenskyy that Ukraine must agree to a framework plan developed by the US, which includes territorial concessions and restrictions on the Ukrainian military. European foreign ministers gathered in Brussels made it clear that they oppose demands that could force Ukraine into humiliating concessions, the agency reports. For example, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski added that Ukraine, as a victim of aggression, should not have its ability to defend itself restricted. The European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, added that any agreement must take into account the position of both the EU and Ukraine itself. Siversk in the Donetsk region remains under the control of Ukrainian defense forces. There are no Russian occupiers in the city. This was reported the day before by the head of the Siversk City Military Administration, Oleksiy Vorobyov. An analysis of the operational situation on other sections of the front follows in our military review.
Pokrovsk played a cruel trick on the occupiers, while the enemy threw all its forces into a desperate attempt to take control of the ruins of the city destroyed by the Russian army. The Ukrainian armed forces launched a counterattack 200 kilometers to the north in Kupiansk. The enemy forces suffered huge losses there, according to the Ukrainian command, and were forced to retreat.
The enemy was cleared out on the northwestern outskirts, they're no longer there, and that's a huge achievement.
In fact, the Ukrainian armed forces have cut off the Russian invaders in the northern part of Kupiansk from their main supplies of provisions, cannon fodder and ammunition. Next, according to Commander Fedorenko, his unit and an adjacent unit set about locating the remaining Russian sabotage groups and clearing them out. As of now, the operation is almost complete.
If you open a map that more or less accurately reflects the line of combat engagement, you'll see that the enemy has been pushed back quite significantly in the northern outskirts. And what does that mean? The farther we push the enemy away from the northern outskirts of Kupiansk, the less room they have to send their sabotage groups directly into the city of Kupiansk.
But unfortunately, the Ukrainian armed forces cannot boast of such brilliant successes on another hottest section of the front near Pokrovsk or in the city itself. Russian assaults there do not stop, day or night. It seems the Kremlin has thrown all its forces into capturing the city. Nevertheless, despite all their efforts, the Ukrainian command notes that our defenders are heroically holding the line.
The situation in and around Pokrovsk is extremely difficult, but somehow we are still holding on.
According to the military, most of the city is now in the so-called gray zone. This is when control over the territory constantly shifts from one side to the other, and fighting is taking place for every single building entrance. Sirsky also fully understands the complexity of the situation in Pokrovsk. In particular, the commander-in-chief stated that the AFU units and other components of the defense forces continue to carry out their tasks in the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration area, despite the fact that the sector remains highly active on the enemy's part.
The enemy's high level of activity persists, but clear coordination and the well-coordinated actions of our units help us to withstand it. We are working to ensure the continuity of our logistics and are taking measures to disrupt the enemy's supply routes.
Nevertheless, the situation in the Pokrovsk direction remains extremely difficult. The enemy, disregarding their own losses, continues to assault AFU positions, the commander-in-chief reports in his operational update.
In just the past 4 days, total enemy losses in the Pokrovsk direction amounted to 487 personnel. Of these, 350 are irrecoverable losses. The exchange fund is being replenished with captured Russian soldiers.
For security reasons, the Ukrainian command does not disclose any further details about the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. However, when it comes to completed special operations on the front line, we can share more. For example, the head of the main intelligence directorate, Kirill Dmitriev, gave an interview in which he shared details of one of the most daring airborne operations by the GUR, during which special forces, having secured certain positions behind enemy lines, managed to break through and establish a full-fledged ground corridor. At that time, Budanov himself was nearby and personally directed the operation.
Why was such an operation necessary, and why was it carried out in this particular way? Because the situation was extremely tense and critical? I want to remind you that all of this happened against the backdrop of official statements from the Russian Federation about having taken the city. When Gerasimov reported to Putin that the city had been captured, and here you need to understand what the situation was like at that moment. Nothing else would have worked. What we did allowed us to win precious time, so that the main units of the armed forces could calmly, or as calmly as possible, approach the city to reinforce it. Let's put it that way.
It is possible that even at this very moment, GUR special units are carrying out another special operation in the Pokrovsk direction. Military public channels are already reporting on the clearing of Pokrovsk, strikes on enemy supply lines, and the establishment of alternative logistics routes now for the Ukrainian armed forces. So all we can do is wait for official confirmation of good news from the Ukrainian command.
Ukrainian defense forces have carried out another strike on the Ryazan oil refinery in Russia. The successful attacks have been officially confirmed by the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. As a result of the attack, a fire broke out in the secondary oil processing area. The facility specializes in the production of gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel, as well as other products, and is also involved in supplying the Russian aerospace forces. The plant itself is one of the largest oil refineries in the aggressor country. A strike was also carried out on the power plant in Novomichurynsk, one of the largest thermal power stations in the Russian Federation. Thus, slowly but surely, Russia is rapidly plunging into darkness and cold. Now, every shelling of energy facilities in Ukraine immediately leads to reciprocal strikes. And while previously Ukrainians mainly used drones, now they are deploying their own long-range missiles, such as the Flamingo and Neptune. In addition, missiles from partners, for example, the American ATAC-MS, are also proving highly effective. Russian military personnel witnessed their effectiveness firsthand the other day at their facilities in Voronezh. We will talk about how the war is moving onto the territory of the would-be conquerors.
Ukrainian long-range drones are cutting off electricity in the occupied Donbas.
Basically, charge your phones. Looks like they've decided to cut our power everywhere. I've already lost count after more than 30 of them. And
Ukrainian winged missiles are halting the sale of Russian oil at the port of Novorossiysk. The Ukrainian defense industry is developing rapidly. Kyiv is ramping up its ability to strike deep into Russian territory.
Now that's an attraction.
This is Belgorod, and basically, there's no electricity anywhere in Belgorod at all.
The only argument in any negotiations or agreements with the aggressor is a powerful Ukrainian army and large-scale domestic production of long-range strike weapons.
In order to somehow bring this war to a stalemate, we need to learn not only to repel enemy attacks on the front line, but also to suppress their logistics and their air force. That is why it became necessary, and I'm not even mentioning the need to strike at enterprises of Russia's military-industrial complex and its energy system.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
To strike military targets of the occupiers in the occupied territories, as well as in Russia's border regions, long-range and rocket drones such as BARS, Polyanitia, Peklo, FP-1, FP2 and Lyuti are mainly used. The scale of strike drone production in Ukraine is such that Russia, including Moscow, is visited by hundreds of drones almost daily. Cities like Moscow and Leningrad, which are the most protected by Russian air defense systems, could start being hit every evening. GARs can reach them and it's not even necessary for this to happen systematically. In addition to drones, Ukraine has also established production of its own cruise missiles. We're talking about the long-range Neptune with an increased range of up to 1,000 kilometers and a warhead of about 260 kilograms. And of course, the Flamingo with a strike range of up to 3,000 kilometers and a 1,000 kilogram warhead.
Usually the warhead of a modern cruise missile weighs 450, but at most 500 kilograms. As a rule, almost all missiles have a 450 kilogram warhead. So what does a 1-ton warhead provide? If it hits a target, for example, an industrial facility, 2 such missiles will completely disable it for at least a year. That is, there will be a single crater about 20 meters in diameter.
From time to time, weapons from Ukraine's Western allies are used in strikes on military targets. British and French Storm Shadow missiles, as well as American Atacamas, which were used to strike the SU the other day. Around Voronezh,
guys, we're being bombed.
Recently, Russian energy infrastructure facilities have increasingly come under the sights of the Ukrainian armed forces. By cutting off electricity to Ukrainians, Putin is dooming Russians to blackouts.
Taking into account the climatic features of the Russian Federation and the tactical and technical characteristics of the Ukrainian side's means of attack, the Russian Federation is facing a harsh winter, both literally and figuratively. First and foremost, these are thermal power plants and other production facilities that sustain the life of major Russian cities.
Ukrainian sanctions have now reached Perm-Krai as well. There, an entire train carrying petroleum products and gas condensate was destroyed. According to posts in Russian social media, the glow could be seen for kilometers. Meanwhile, Z channels are already hysterical about sabotage. As a result, 9 tank cars moving as part of a freight train caught fire. 2 fire trains were dispatched to the scene of the emergency and traffic on the section was halted. And there will only be more news like this going forward. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz announced the delivery of long-range missiles to Ukraine. In addition, Ukraine has received its first Terrahawk Paladin anti-aircraft systems. Let's not forget about the unprecedented military aid from Spain as well. We'll tell you more about all of this in detail shortly.
Even more aid and support. The German Chancellor has promised to equip the Ukrainian army with long-range weapon systems. However, Merz did not disclose details about the number of missiles or the delivery timeline.
For months, we have been working intensively with the Ukrainian government on implementing long-range fire projects, as we technically call them. The Ukrainian army will be equipped with such weapon systems.
At the same time, the Chancellor refused to answer a question about Germany's previous reluctance to supply Ukraine with Taurus long-range cruise missiles. He described this approach as a tactic to increase pressure on the aggressor country, Russia.
The possibility of operating the Taurus missiles directly depends on the level of training of technical personnel. That is, apparently the point is that only Bundeswehr servicemen can use the Taurus missiles. And the process of training and preparing Ukrainian specialists, especially those who are highly skilled and knowledgeable in the relevant fields, for this will take quite a long period of time.
Germany is the largest European donor of military aid to Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, the government has provided Ukraine with assistance totaling more than 50 billion euros. In September, Berlin launched a new initiative to procure long-range drones jointly with Ukraine's defense industry. Germany will also allocate an additional 150 million euros to purchase weapons from the US for Kiev.
Germany is well aware of the possibilities of direct military confrontation with the Russian Federation. That is why it is deeply invested in ensuring the defense capability of the Ukrainian state and accordingly in the technical rearmament of Ukraine's defense forces.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Air Force has strengthened its air defense with the new British Terrahawk Paladin weapon system. The number of units delivered has not been disclosed, but even a small batch of such systems will significantly enhance Ukraine's air defense.
For the Ukrainian side, this means creating a so-called focal air defense system to protect key logistical and military facilities from being hit by the enemy's aerodynamic means. First and foremost, this refers to UAVs. This system is mobile and accordingly can be redeployed to any location. And taking into account its autonomous use, this significantly increases the Ukrainian side's ability to counteract, as well as that of the Russian Federation.
Spain will also allocate 615 million euros to support Ukraine, the lion's share of which is earmarked specifically for military needs. In
the first place, this is a program for additional arms purchases for the needs of the Ukrainian armed forces from the United States. The second is, accordingly, the strengthening of Ukraine's air defense systems. And accordingly, this is the nature of logistical and technical support, including the transfer by the Spanish side of heavy armored vehicles and strike systems that are currently in service with the Spanish army.
After the start of the full-scale war, Ukraine increased its production of weapons and the implementation of new technologies, which are already being used at the front. The volume of domestic weapons production has increased tenfold.
Ukraine has scaled up the production of the Bogdana self-propelled artillery systems to 20 units per month. These are record figures, even for NATO countries. A distinctive feature is that this is a modified 155mm caliber, which is the NATO standard, plus accordingly the price-to-quality ratio. In addition, Ukraine's defense forces have increased artillery shell production, and the increase has been record-breaking. There is also a scaling up of production of both FPV drones and, accordingly, strike drones with a target engagement range of over 1,500 kilometers.
Earlier, Volodymyr Zelenskyy stated that the production of domestic weapons, particularly ballistics and drones, is one of the key tasks for the government and manufacturers.
It is also worth noting the scaling up of production of electronic warfare systems and radars. In this segment as well, the Ukrainian defense industry holds one of the leading positions in the world, and accordingly the production of naval drones.
All of this means that Ukrainian developers have demonstrated the ability to create high-precision weaponry capable of destroying important enemy military targets deep behind the lines.
Nepotism, Russian style in all its glory. The chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, got his mistress a job at the Russian Ministry of Defense. The mistress and mother of the chief of the General Staff's illegitimate daughter, Elena Selifanova, not only received a job at the Ministry of Defense, but also acquired elite real estate in the center of Moscow.
A new scandal has erupted in the Russian media space around Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. Investigative projects are publishing materials claiming that the general's alleged mistress, Elena Selifanova, received positions within the Ministry of Defense and expensive real estate in central Moscow.
Gerasimov's declaration is conspicuously modest. Journalists have calculated that the family of the head of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, owns property worth between 100 and 150 million rubles.
According to journalists, in addition to his official family, Gerasimov has had another secret family for many years. According to investigators, 47-year-old Selifanova gave birth to the general's daughter in 2014, and 5 years later Gerasimov acknowledged paternity, as evidenced by leaks obtained by the editorial team. Meanwhile, the official wife of the head of the Russian General Staff is also doing quite well. In January,
in 2013, Gerasimov's wife registered ownership of an apartment at Kodinskoye Pole. Its area is 131 square meters. 14 Aviakonstruktora Mikoyana Street is a business-class residential complex called Private Square. The average price per square meter here is just over 380,000 rubles. Thus, the property owned by the wife of the Chief of the General Staff is valued at approximately 50 million rubles.
Before Gerasimov's mistress had a child, Selifanova worked in small companies in the hotel business. But later, as reported, she was employed at a military unit of the Ministry of Defense and later directly in the ministry itself. She worked there for 5 years and received the rank of first-class state service referent. It is not reliably known what she is currently doing. At the same time, according to investigators, Genchera began acquiring luxury real estate. From 2019 to 2024, she became the owner of several apartments in the Tagansky district, a spacious residence in Kamovniki, and an apartment in the famous house on the embankment. It is possible that these properties are jointly owned with Gerasimov himself.
In 2014, General Gerasimov built a 500 square meter backyard house in, quote, a strictly guarded cottage settlement of Afiniva. And a couple of years later, he completed a giant bathhouse measuring 236 square meters. This is what Gerasimov's plot looks like from satellite view. The owner of this property is hidden in the extracts from the Rosregister registry. All the properties are owned by the Russian Federation.
The total value of the purchases made by the mistress is estimated to exceed 200 million rubles. It is claimed that Selifanova gets around in premium class cars. After the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the woman regularly flies to Turkey. Border crossing data studied by journalists show at least 7 trips to Antalya over 2 years. Investigators also pay special attention to her relatives. Serapanova's brother Sergei holds a high-ranking position in an oil and gas company connected to the inner circle of Rosneft's leadership.